40 minutes north of Auckland, divers from a small marine lab were swimming over a reef that looked wrong. Where kelp should have been swaying in the current, there was bare gray rock, scoured clean, crowded edge to edge with black, spiny sea urchins. It was 1965, and the biologist studying that reef, Bill Ballantyne, had just told a room of local fishermen what he wanted. Every hook, every spear, every crayfish pot kept out of Goat Island Bay. For good. Some of them agreed. The others told him, only half joking, that they'd kill him. Ballantine wouldn't soften it. He wanted one stretch of New Zealand coast where nothing was taken at all, protected long enough to find out whether the barren reef everyone had come to accept as normal was anything close to it. It took him 12 years to get it. Then came the real question, whether the reef would prove him right, and for a long while the answer looked like no. The rock stayed bare. The urchin stayed. From the surface, Goat Island looked like every other stretch of that coast. 90 kilometers up the same coast, a second reef was under protection too, but with one rule left different. When the Poor Knights Islands were protected, recreational fishing was allowed to stay, a softer version of exactly what Ballantine had refused. One reef had his absolute ban, the other had the compromise. And for 17 years, that was the only difference between them. Which one was right? The water would decide. The reef that shouldn't have been bare. Ballantine wasn't the first person to look at Goat Island and think something was wrong. A botanist named Val Chapman had already worried the marine lab would be almost pointless if every boat passing through kept taking from the reef around it. Ballantine took that concern and pushed it much further. By the 1960s, New Zealand had thousands of miles of coastline where people could fish, and not a single stretch where they couldn't. That bothered him as a scientist. Every fishery study was comparing one exploited place with another, one reef under heavy fishing against another under a little less. There was no untouched control, nowhere to see what happened when people simply stopped taking animals out. And Goat Island was already showing him why that mattered. Since the early 1950s, snapper and rock lobster had been pulled from the reef. Both were major predators there. As their numbers fell, kina, the native sea urchin, spread across the rocks. Kina are relentless grazers. They bite through kelp until little is left but the holdfast, the tough root-like anchor gripping it to the rock. Then they move on. Enough kina can work across a reef this way until a place that once held a forest of kelp is stripped to bare rock. By 1964, the same pattern was showing up well beyond that one reef. University of Auckland botanist Frank Dromgoole had been diving around the Hauraki Gulf, the stretch of coast and islands east of Auckland, and seeing it again and again. Bare rock where kelp should have been. Half a dozen sites showed it, Goat Island Beach among them. He gave the condition a name, an urchin barren. To Ballantine, that barren was evidence something had already gone wrong. To the fishermen who worked there, it was just the reef they knew. 12 years for one word. For 6 years, Ballantine had to solve a problem that had nothing to do with fish. New Zealand had no law for the kind of reserve he wanted. So he kept at it. Letters, talks to dive clubs, meetings with councils. Enough pressure over enough years that Parliament finally passed the Marine Reserves Act in 1971, the first law that gave New Zealand any way to create a marine reserve at all. Ballantine had his law. He still didn't have Goat Island. His first application was rejected. He filed again, and for the next 4 years the proposal barely moved. Then the argument came to his kitchen. New Zealand's Attorney General drove out personally and spent 6 hours at Ballantine's table, trying to find the version everyone might accept. Keep the reserve. Loosen it a little. Allow some rod fishing. let people take a few crayfish, give the local community something back, and perhaps the whole fight could finally end. Ballantine had spent years asking for one stretch of coast where nothing was taken. 6 hours at that table didn't change the word nothing. When the Attorney General finally left, Ballantine walked up the hill to see Roddy Matheson, the farmer whose land the Marine Lab sat on. Roddy wasn't quick with an answer. They had tea. They talked about the grass. Eventually, he told Ballantine he was doing the right thing. Ballantine trusted that more than anything the government had said all afternoon. By then, Ballantine's idea had started gathering support beyond Goat Island. The New Zealand Underwater Association backed it. Then, the Marine Sciences Society. In 1975, the government finally declared Goat Island a marine reserve. But the reef still had 2 years to wait. On the 26th of October, 1977, the signs went up and the rules finally reached the water. The local newspaper marked it with one line. "Nothing to do at Goat Island Bay anymore." That was the joke. A beach where you couldn't fish, couldn't spear anything, couldn't take a crayfish home. What was the point? Ballantine had spent 12 years creating exactly that place. Now the waiting began. If you'd been sitting at that kitchen table, would you have taken the compromise? A little fishing allowed, the community kept happy, the fight finally over? Tell me in the comments. Resolution, the part that took 30 years to notice. For years, Goat Island refused to reward the experiment. Divers went back over the reef and found the same bare rock, the same kina, holding the ground. From the surface, the reserve looked much like the coast outside it, where fishing had never stopped. Even the fish count seemed reluctant to move. Red moki increased, snapper barely did. That was the species everyone was watching. If snapper were going to help bring the kina down, the surveys gave little sign of it. Year after year, the reef seemed to be asking Ballantine for more patience. No one had closed a reef this completely before. There was no timetable for what recovery should look like, or even a guarantee that removing fishing would be enough to change the place at all. Ballantine's own colleagues were more unsettled by the wait than the fishermen were. Then the predators began to show themselves. By the mid-1990s, rock lobster inside Goat Island were about 4 times as dense as in the fished water just beyond the reserve. And out on the reef, the kina were beginning to lose ground. Snapper crushed the younger urchins with their back teeth. Rock lobster pulled the larger ones from cracks in the reef and broke them open. Since the reserve began, kina had been grazing faster than the kelp could return. Now that balance started to shift. The Barren did not disappear overnight. It retreated from the edges, patch by patch, while kelp moved back across rock that had been bare for years. Snapper remained the puzzle. The diver surveys still showed surprisingly little change, even as the reef around them was recovering. Eventually, researchers realized part of the problem was the way they were counting. Snapper kept their distance from divers. A person swimming a survey line could pass through a reef full of fish and still miss much of what was there. So researchers changed their method. They put cameras in the water with bait and waited for the fish to come to them. The picture changed immediately. By the early 2000s, legal-sized snapper were more than 14 times as abundant inside Goat Island as in the fished water just outside it. Rock lobster were running 4 to 5 times denser. None of it had cost the government anything beyond the price of the signage. The kelp took longer. Nearly 3 decades after the reserve was enforced, the forest Ballantine had hoped for had spread back across much of the reef. He had removed one thing from Goat Island, fishing, and then waited long enough to see what the reef would do with the space. The answer had taken decades, but Goat Island was no longer bare. 90 kilometers up the coast, another protected reef had been running a similar experiment. There, one rule had been different from the start. The poor knights had made a different choice. These islands sit off the Northland coast, deep water and subtropical, famous among divers for the fish that gather around them. Here, the argument wasn't about kina and kelp. It was about snapper. The big adults mattered most, the fish anglers crossed open water for. So when protection came to the poor knights, the rules left room for them. Commercial fishing was banned. Rod and line fishing stayed. At the time, the concession seemed almost too small to matter. One diving advocate later remembered the thinking as a little line fishing being just a sneeze. For a while, the reef gave them no obvious reason to think otherwise. Then some of its most conspicuous fish started becoming harder to find. Golden snapper, pink mau-mau, and the ordinary snapper anglers had fought to keep catching. For 17 years, that compromise stayed in place. On the map, the poor knights sat inside a marine reserve. In the water, hooks were still deciding which snapper got to grow old. Removing them took a 2-year court fight with local anglers. In 1998, recreational fishing finally ended. Then the reef answered quickly. Within 2 to 3 years, large snapper were more than 7 times as abundant as they had been under the old rules. Total snapper biomass rose by more than 800%. After 17 years of waiting, the change came almost as soon as the last hooks left the water. For 17 years, the poor knights weren't recovering slowly. They weren't recovering at all. Neither reef gives us a perfect ending. Goat Island is still recovering inside a coastline that never stopped being fished. Even now, some fish stocks remain below what they might have been before commercial pressure reached this coast, and crayfish numbers have slipped again in recent years as pressure builds just beyond the reserve boundary. Ballantine understood the limit of a single protected bay, so he kept pushing for something bigger. Goat Island had already shown that protection could spill across a boundary. Ballantine wanted that effect repeated along the coast. He died in 2015. 10 years later, New Zealand moved closer to the system he had spent decades arguing for. On Goat Island's 50th anniversary, the government expanded the reserve for the first time since 1977, pushing its offshore boundary from about 800 meters to 3 kilometers. Across the wider Hauraki Gulf, 19 new protected areas were added, spread across different habitats. It still wasn't the clean version Ballantine would have wanted. A late amendment reopened commercial fishing in some areas, but Goat Island itself had grown. And there was another irony Ballantine lived to see. The fishermen who once threatened him eventually worked the edge of the reserve, because the fish spilling out of it were bigger and more plentiful than what they could find farther away. Ballantine's response was simple. That was the point. The Marine Reserves Act he spent 6 years fighting for would eventually be used to protect 44 stretches of New Zealand coast. Around the same years Goat Island was taking shape, no-take reserves were being worked out independently in California, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. But Goat Island became one of the first anywhere, and one of the places marine biologists could point to when they wanted to show what a fully protected reef could do. In 1996, Ballantine was given the Goldman Environmental Prize, one of the field's highest honors, for work that started with a barren reef almost nobody else thought was worth saving. But the stronger proof was still underwater. The bare rock had filled back in, the predators had returned, and fishermen were now working the edge of the very reserve they once fought to stop. Ballantine had asked for one place where nothing was taken, just long enough to find out what the sea would do. Nearly 50 years later, Goat Island was still answering him. Which reef surprised you more, Goat Island or the Poor Knights? Tell me in the comments. And if you know someone who would have taken the compromise Ballantine refused, share this with them. If you want the next story when it's ready, subscribe so you don't miss it.